Hello and welcome back to Briefed, the Cam FM fortnightly show and competition, although it hasn't been that very much fortnightly recently because we have just had a summer break. But we're back and hello, Anna.
Hello, it's nice to be back after the break. It feels like absolutely ages since we've been recording and things.
I know, I was just saying to you, it seems like it's been about a month since we've last spoken. So, yes, anyhow, on with the episode. So for this episode, the brief was to write a piece of any genre in response to the quote by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, Fais de ta vie un rêve et d'un rêve une réalité, or in English, make of your life a dream and your dream a reality. A bit of a seemingly profound quotation to work with, which may or may not explain the fact that we only had 2 submissions this week. But of course, there was also a bit of a lag in communication over the summer from myself. But it is brilliant to be back.
Mm-hmm. And I just have a question. Why did you choose the French? Just out of interest. I know you do study French, but what attracted you to keep it in French? And was it something to do with, I don't know, the French literature, or it made sense more in French?
Do you know what, Anna? It's been a long time since we've been at university, and to be honest, I'm just missing French. Like I've been keeping up with it, but there's only so much you can do over the summer at home. So I thought, do you know what? I'm going to stick the original French in there. And in fact, as I'll go on to explain in just a minute, I've actually had that quotation pinned up on my Twitter wall as a sort of backdrop for about 5 years. I just love the quote, and part of the reason I love the quote is because I'm not really sure what it means. That's certainly why I wanted to set it as a bit of a writing challenge and to see the avenues that people would go down.
A bit of an OG inspirational quote there.
Indeed, and I love Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. Obviously, Le Petit Prince, the Little Prince, and he wrote that. So so. I shall now explain, before reading the 2 submissions this week, a little bit more about why I chose that quote. Why exactly did I choose the quote, make of your life a dream and your dream a reality? The question that I'm sure has been on everybody's minds. Well, I suppose mainly because of the way it treats the impossibility of the real. That is to say, the notion that one has to transcend the reality prescribed to them in order to then live out their fantasy as if it were a reality. Briefed is a podcast that was essentially conceived out of the void left by and the creative potential offered by the lockdown period. So therefore I thought that a quotation which explored the notion of our state of living was particularly apt as we all emerge from a period of widespread existential rumination, which is something that certainly abounded in Saint-Exupéry's work, and this rumination, whether it be on a political, health-related or spiritual level. But this quotation also means a lot to me. I mean, as you'll know, as I just said in our intro just then, I've had it pinned on my Twitter wall for about half a decade. But it means a lot to me also because of the person who said it, Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. It's important to understand a bit about his life. He was a French aviator and writer born into the aristocracy in Lyon in 1900, who pushed the limits of both of these aspects of his life as he grappled with adventure through a poetic lens. Conscripted into the French Air Force in 1921, he joined the Compagnie Latécoère in 1926 and established, or certainly helped to establish, airmail routes over such places as Northwest Africa and South America. And these sorts of places, as he would have looked down from the cockpit during such journeys, for those of you who are familiar with his work, would have undoubtedly encouraged the emergence of the trope of the desert that he quite often resorted to. A zone of arid abandonment beheld with wonder. He was forced to flee France for the United States after Nazi occupation in 1940, where he remained in exile until 1943, and during which time he wrote his masterpiece turned cultural phenomenon, Le Petit Prince, or The Little Prince in English. He resumed flying with his former squadron after exile, to then disappear during a reconnaissance mission over France in 1944. While wreckage from his plane was identified from an area of seabed in Marseille in 1950, the true cause of his death remains as much a mystery as some of his enigmatic writings. But going back to the quote and the brief that I set, I mean, for anybody who has read Le Petit Prince, I mean, frankly, what rock have you been living under if you haven't? The social critique throughout with characters such as the sales clerk, the vain man, the businessman and the drunkard stands out with its portrayal of a materialistic society suffering from a moral decline. However, beyond that is the spiritual journey of its protagonist, the little prince, as he comes to existentially rue the ills of love and his relationship with the rose, but also to rue the harshness of the real in the zonal isolation provided by the desert on Earth. And it's this confrontation with the harshness of the real, which is a theme which has inspired me for quite a few years, and thus I thought tied into his quotation, make of your life a dream and your dream a reality, or in the original French, fais de ta vie un rêve et d'un rêve une réalité. Achieve your goals, strive for the impossible, and don't give up. Might be a more simplistic interpretation of it. So therefore, given that this was the last brief that I would have the pleasure to set on this podcast, I thought it would be a good idea to go out with a bang. Albeit this is a rather profound writing stimulus, so it's been interesting to see how it was interpreted. As already mentioned, we had 2 submissions for this episode. A poem from Andy Freeman and a monologue from Biliana Todorova. Apologies if I butchered the pronunciation of that. We start with a reading of Andy's submission entitled Requiem for the Wives by Anna.
Our men came home ashamed and broken, our mocking bunting a worthless greeting. And then our years of war began, listening to the stammerers, desperate coupling with the angry, holding the shaking, pleading with the drunk and the starers at the wall. We lived with nightmares in our sleeping houses, sharing the tobacco smoke, the leather and the sweat. We buried our men with their medals, but no one marked our sacrifice in the hidden terraced houses of our town. Now this is another war-related submission from Andy, and it shows the wealth and variety of experience created by war, beyond the politics, even the fighting itself, is the domestic aftermath, which lasts for decades. Women are often glamorised for their part in the war effort, and indeed they did do some incredible work. You think of the line girls, ammunitions workers and the nurses on the front line who worked incredibly hard and who we obviously wouldn't have won the war without. But what is little talked about is the aftermath of war, and as the poem is discussing, the aftercare that the soldiers needed, the husbands, the sons, the brothers. And this is especially difficult at a time when the mental health problems they were experiencing went unrecognised, and almost any kind of useful professional help just didn't exist at the time, and they didn't understand the conditions and the experiences they were having. A line I particularly like is the idea of the hidden terraces, reflecting both the hidden and private nature of the struggles, the domestic struggles that are sort of kept behind closed doors, but also it's a complete opposite to the microcosm of war, war is loud, explosive, and the trenches in no man's land were also barren of life, twisted, dystopian, completely different from the built-up streets and the regulated suburban life the soldiers would have to come back to. I think it's always interesting to think about the perhaps forgotten party in any situation, especially the historical, and acknowledge their sacrifice and effort, which this poem does incredibly well and very poignantly. And thank you very much, Andy, for sending it in, and for your continued support of the show.
And I totally agree with Anna's analysis there, and particularly enjoyed her reading of the poem as requested by Andy, so as to be fittingly read from a female perspective. For me, while it was a poem that touched on the legacy of war, there was additionally an opportunity to explore the futility almost of military glory and the worthlessness of medals for service. One is indeed led to think about the experiences which never left the men who returned from battle, and particularly the effect that this had on women. Not only did they keep the economy going on the home front, but they faced domestic war as they cared for and confronted their mentally wounded other halves in the aftermath of battle. While we could not arrange an interview over Zoom due to technical issues, Andy wrote in some thoughts about his poem on email to share with us. He argued that he doesn't think enough attention has been given to the experiences of women who lived through those terrible years of the First World War from 1914 to 1918 and the post-war aftermath. He continues that our views of those years have mainly focused on the soldiers who fought, their experiences recounted most vividly by the likes of war poets Wilfred Owen, Siegfried Sassoon, Isaac Rosenberg, etc., and prose writers like Robert Graves and Edmund Blunden. And consequently, the hardship and suffering experienced by the mothers, wives, girlfriends and daughters of the soldiers has been neglected and undervalued. He said that many women worked in dangerous conditions in munitions factories, served heroically as nurses described in books like Vera Britton's Testament of Youth, and ordinary housewives had to cope with loneliness and hardship, having to bring up families by themselves until the men could return home. He said so he was thinking of the female perspective coupled with our recent greater understanding of the psychological effects of warfare on those involved in combat, leading to depression, homelessness, suicide and all other consequences of what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder. He added that the men who fought in the First World War were not professional soldiers, especially those in the so-called PALS battalions, and didn't have recourse to any psychological counselling. They were just ordinary working men driven to enlist by a variety of contradictory motives who experienced unthinkable horrors in the trenches on the Western Front and other regions of the world. They must have carried their psychological as well as their physical scars along with them for the rest of their lives. He concluded that the wives especially must have borne the brunt of male frustration. Their dream of resuming peaceful, fulfilled lives must have vanished quite rapidly. He argues, look at the most recent figures for increases in domestic violence during lockdown. For many men returning home in 1918 to 1919, life must have felt like a permanent lockdown. He says that there is a bigger story to be told here, but that this brief poem only introduces the topic. He also justified the relevance of his poem to the brief by suggesting that the topic of dreams, and of course its twin, nightmares, set by the brief team, brought all these strands together, and he thanks the programme for being the catalyst for this. Thank you once again for your submission, Andy. And now I'm going to give a reading of our second submission, a monologue sent in by Biliana entitled Monologue by a Character Eternally Doomed to Live Through Any Story Written Under the Premise, and then I woke up and it was all a dream. Look, if there's someone listening, I'm going to need you to listen carefully, because I don't think I have much time. Did you ever write that story? You know, the one that ends in that god-awful cop-out, and then I woke up and it was all a dream? I know you have. Everyone has. If you think you don't remember, it's because you were 6 and whatever you wrote was, with no respect whatsoever, awful. And you definitely thought you were being clever as well. But didn't you ever wonder who the I was? People always assume they're the ones suffering through whatever personal hell they've manifested onto a page. Well, it's me. I'm the guy. This, I've learned, is a figure of speech. I'll actually be whatever you make me. On several occasions I've been a caterpillar. So, I guess there's one for every kind of story, and I promise I got the absolute worst. You definitely didn't think of that, did you? I really do despise children. Of course I remember when it started. Child humans have been writing stories for thousands of years, have probably been dreaming for more, and have definitely been remarkably dull since Adam bit Eve, or whatever happened. I can't say I care to know. You see, ever since those first etchings appeared in that cursed Mesopotamian cave, I've been that I, living out every single dream story ever written. I actually miss when infants would put rock to rock and presto, I'd be riding a mammoth. At least those stories were short because there was never enough wool. Nowadays, only the weird ones ever mention that sort of thing. God, I hope no one's ever made that into a movie. Speaking of weird children, Uncle Freud, we've met a few times, never mentioned the developmental stage in which, by some deep-seated compulsion, everyone's prodigal offspring inevitably write some drivel where they, can levitate to the top of bleeding Krakatoa and back only to inevitably jolt awake. And I thought that guy understood dreams. You want to know something else I don't understand? The main attraction at the funfair of children's personal horrors seems to be things happening to the eyes. It's a real theme. Spontaneous transformation into hamsters, leaving behind two cutesy black holes and the sort of panic that wakes you up at the end, of course, but not before I've suffered through two sides of wide-ruled A4. Getting blindfolded during a hostage operation involving at least one queen. Things that fly, eating them. You'd never worry about it consciously, would you? So why so many children think something's going to come in through the window and enucleate them for breakfast is beyond me. Or why they think that's it. That's the worst. You'd think it'd be turning up to school naked. They're really not all bad. Well, bad as in unpleasant, I mean, because of course they're all bad. The problem, even with the nice ones, is that the best thing that can happen to even the most imaginative little dumpling isn't really the best thing that can happen. Ever. A house made entirely out of sweets is only exciting the first few hundred times. And after that, it just gets boring again. That's commonly misspelled with a double R, if you happen to be interested. Boring. Really, I'm so bored. I wonder if the sort of hurricane some kids dream might swallow the earth and all its furiously scribbling little mites might actually happen one day and put an end to it all. I mean, I'd swallow myself if I could, if only it would just be quiet after the whole palaver. But if something were to actually happen, well, everyone would probably end up in a metal box in orbit. Anyway, and then I'd just get blooped through some little space children's tripe forever and ever, just like some little earthlings said. Maybe those ones weren't quite so stupid. Perhaps I've been in the presence of prophets. Anyway, even they didn't manage to think of me. And I suppose, in a way, they're sort of better than I'll ever be. At least their lives are real lives, and their dreams are just dreams. At least they get to wake up. To wake up. To wake up, eyes intact, to find every single word of my life has been a dream of my own. Well, that's one dream I'd be happy to live. And then I woke up, and it was all a dream. And that was the monologue, a very humorous presentation of children and their imagination running amok. I then had the chance to talk with Biliana a bit more over Zoom about her submission. And now I am joined by Biliana. Hello, Biliana.
Hello.
How are you doing?
I'm alright. How are you?
Yeah. We'll go with good. We'll go with good. So, in this interview, I am just going to ask you some questions about your monologue, which you entitled "Monologue by a Character Eternally Doomed to Live Through Any Story Written Under the Premise, and Then I Woke Up, and It Was All a Dream." Very interesting title indeed. But before we sort of get to the monologue, I just first of all wanted to get to know you a bit in terms of you being a student at Cambridge, your sort of writing background, and why you applied. Why you gave in a submission to the show.
So, I'm going into my second year of Natsuki at Churchill. That's my day job, and I don't really have a writing background. I have a drawing background, but it doesn't work as well on radio.
No, I'd assume not. It'd be a bit difficult. Yeah.
No. But yeah, I always think I'd be really bad at filling out an online dating profile because I'm really very boring. So I like long walks on the beach, small children are afraid of me, that kind of thing.
Okay, and so in terms of the monologue itself, obviously I've just read it out. The first thing I sort of picked up on was the sort of humorous way in which you wrote from the perspective of a persona who presents themselves as the victim of this sort of god-awful gimmick of turning out to be the hypothetical subject of the writer's dream. In terms of that, I mean, do you have any ideas about why people resort to using this gimmick in their writing? I mean, do you think it can be effective rather than overused, or is it forever condemned to being a cop-out, in your opinion?
Well, I suppose the appeal is that it allows you to write anything, really, because it kind of sets up these parameters within which the rules of reality don't have to be obeyed. So I think in that sense it's overused because it's effective. Like, even if it's a cop-out, it's a good starter cop-out because it has the merit of letting you play about with reality a bit within a kind of justified space. It's also just fun to say at the end of anything.
Yeah, because I quite often sort of think to myself, oh, I'd love to write a screenplay, and then, oh, wouldn't it be a twist of events if none of it actually happened? And it was quite funny when I read this sort of monologue. I was going like, yeah, you've got a point there. It is a bit of a cop out, I suppose. It's not the most inventive sort of narrative you could come up with. I mean, there was also a line in the monologue as well where you're talking about children etching into walls in the Stone Age. There was a comment which I certainly found quite amusing, which was those stories were short because there was never enough wall. So that sort of got me thinking, I mean, do you think that more generally flouting the bounds of imagination ruins literature? Do you think there's a point where it's, that's too far, that's too detached from reality? Do you enjoy more reality in writing, or would you advocate for transcending the sort of bounds of imagination?
I suppose it depends on how unhappy you are with your own reality. I'm not very well versed on the fantasy genre, but I suppose there's a reason it's so successful. But I guess in that instance, I meant that even if your story does do a bad job of flouting those boundaries, if it's short, there's less to suffer through. That's always a good thing.
Yes. And I mean, like, also towards the end of the monologue, there was some very interesting stuff going on a sort of meta level when you suggest that the dream subject's dreamed reality is in fact a dream, and that they strive to wake up to experience reality. I mean, given that this is ultimately the theme underpinning the monologue, you know, the sort of establishing the boundaries between the imagined and the real, how does your monologue take on Antoine de Saint-Exupéry's quotation, "Make of your life a dream and your dream a reality"? Why did you feel compelled to write what you did? What was your take on that?
Oh God, compelled is a very strong word. Well, I suppose in the end I thought that kind of embodied it best out of the ideas I had. It certainly made use of that imperative, make. Like, you're forced to have your reality and dreams just be one. I did have another idea, which was a kind of sci-fi situation where the quotation would be the tagline of like a corporation trying to sell people some reality-altering device. But I think that's the plot of like 10 young adult novels. So I thought, go with the dream one.
Bit of originality. I think, and just like more generally in terms of that quotation, "Make of your life a dream and your dream a reality." I mean, as I've already mentioned this in the show, but I sort of set that quotation because not only is it interesting, but I think really confusing. I've never been able to make really head nor tail of it myself. I mean, what do you make of that quote? I'm just interested to know.
Good career advice?
Good career advice.
Oh, I don't know. I'll get back to you.
Yeah, it is a confusing one. And I mean, I was going to ask as well, I mean, have you written much during lockdown? But you've sort of got an interesting, you're coming at it from an interesting angle because you're actually a sciences student, you're a bit more into art. But I suppose the question still stands more generally. I mean, this show was created in part as a writing competition, but also as a show to sort of fill the void left by lockdown, and to give us all something to do, quite frankly. So in terms of focusing on the lockdown, have you found that when you've had time to draw and that, has there been a more creative flourishing than usual? How have you sort of used the lockdown to your advantage, perhaps, or has it all been work?
I'm trying to think what the opposite is of a flourishing. Maybe a wilting. No, I think I've been trying to kind of come to terms with the fact that just because you're suddenly given all of this time doesn't mean you necessarily have to make use of it as, in the best possible way for you. And so I've been trying to accept the kind of nothingness. But I've done a lot. Hasn't necessarily been useful, but it's been a lot. The volume's been there.
And thank you
very
to
much
Biliana once
for
again for making the time for that interview. And my thanks also to Andy Freeman for his submission.
Yes.
And now over to Anna for our final brief.
Is it our final brief? Oh my goodness, I just realised it is, isn't it? Yeah. So as you guys know, Cameron does quotes. My briefs are slightly more chaotic in that I choose a randomised word or couple of words and we use that as the impetus. Now for this week, we have along the similar lines to hatred a couple of weeks back. This one is a sort of concept that you can use as your impetus, and you don't have to use this in the passage itself like with Captain Curtis Glass, although if you can, you want to, or a derivative of that word. But yeah, this is just used to inspire you, to act your impetus, that sort of thing. So without further ado, I will randomise it. Okay, it's come up with idolatry. That's an interesting one. It's slightly more niche. I know that has more of a religious context, but you can use it. I'm happy if you want to draw it out of its sort of religious or worshipping context. Idolatry of people, things, anything like that. Yeah, that sounds like interesting interpretation. So happy to open that. Yeah, interesting to see how people interpret that brief.
As always, bring your creativity.
Yeah,
and
yes. as always, any genre whatsoever, fiction, non-fiction, poem, short story, script, anything like that. We're happy to receive, no matter what the length is. So to summarise, this brief is to write a piece with idolatry as your impetus. And as it's our final episode and we're sort of erring on the edge of term starting again, it would be lovely if any incoming freshers would like to send in entries. I'm more than happy to, might be fun. One of the great things about Cambridge is that there's lots of chances to get your writing shown, whether that be through the theatre or whether that be through writing groups, things like the Maze. And our show is very much more lowbrow than that. So if you're looking for something to ease you into Cambridge writing, get into the swing of it, then feel free to send in a submission. We'd love to read from you.
And start your Cambridge journey in style with us.
Preacher Zadie Smith starting their journey by sending it over briefed. We could dream. So yeah, anyone can apply, incoming freshers, second years, third years, anyone whatsoever. And the email to send in your entries to is briefedradio@gmail.com. You can find this information on our Facebook page. The deadline for entries is the 22nd of September. That's the Tuesday at midnight. And ready for our next final show, which will be aired on the 26th.
The last episode. How has it come to this already?
So that'll be 5 with the introductory, Curtain Cactus Glass, your first quote, hatred, your second quote, and now this one. So 6, like a TV show's worth.
Yeah, one of the greatest series you will ever hear. And
you've heard of The Bodyguard, you've heard of Afterlife. Get ready for Brief.
Have you heard of Briefed? A seminal work. Okay. Thank you very much, guys, for listening again, and we look forward to reading your submissions for our next show on the 26th of September. Enjoy your Saturday evening. Take care, and goodbye.
See you soon.